Now the last time we put a bunch of compact SUVs together, the Renault Kiger stood out just on the back of how much it offered to you for less money than the competition. But things have moved on quite a bit since then, and now a vast features list and a premium image are a must-have to stand out, which brings us to the Kia Sonet and the Mahindra XUV. These are the two newest contenders in this space, and let's see how they perform. At this point, you might be wondering why we don't have a Tata Nexon here, but we did ask for one to be featured in this test but hadn't received a response from Tata Motors by the time of filming. Now, given the length constraints in this segment, car makers have to work quite hard to still make these practical SUVs. And the Kiger is a great example of this. It has 405 litres of boot space. That's the most out of these three cars here. And the way Renault has carved out this space is a theme that all three have followed, but with slightly different results. It has been carved out with this quite high lip and a very low floor. So what you see is, yes, for a family of four, if you pack lightly, you will have enough space, but putting stuff in and putting stuff out is slightly difficult. Now another positive of the Kiger is that the sides are flat, which means that you can stack things up vertically easier. Now at 385 litres, the smallest boot among the three cars is of the Sonet, but in practice things aren't all that bad. To start with, you have quite a low lip and even the floor is fairly high, so a heavy bag is very easy to sort of place inside. And then the back seat is pushed really quite further forward, so it has that depth to fit in quite a bit more stuff than you would otherwise think. Now, one of the problems with the XUV 300 was its boot space, and Mahindra has tried to address it with the 3XO, and there have been some improvements. But as you can see, it's still a bit of a tough ask. Like the Kiger, you have a high lip and the floor is low, which is one of the changes that have been made. So yeah, lifting up heavy stuff is going to be the order of the day. And then you also realize that the length of the boot isn't quite as much as the other two, so I've had to make this one stand vertically, which is going to be a bit of an issue. And you also have these wheel arches that intrude into space, so packing things in is going to be quite an ask compared to the other two. But you get these hooks which are quite sturdy, and like the other two cars here, you get a 60-40 split. See these three cars together and it's clear that a tighter budget doesn't need to look restrained on the road. The Renault Kiger is the narrowest and shortest car here, and it does show in its more compact stance. But it is probably the most cohesively styled, packing a good deal of aggression into its footprint. In contrast, the Mahindra XUV 3XO stands out with its size. Its origins, the C-segment SUV, are clear with its wide and flat stance. While much of the bodywork has been carried over from the last car, the new face breaks from the norm with its big gloss black panels and the large vertically arranged light clusters. The slightly abrupt side profile still hasn't been fully rectified, but the segment-leading 17-inch wheels help somewhat in this regard. Further, the reworked boot with the full-width lighting has brought a good deal of style to this Mahindra. The Kia Sonet is probably the most polished-looking one of the lot here, especially when paired with the rich paint options and differentiated front styling you can have with the various specs. The wider new lighting and grille add a good deal of mass to the Sonet, and the general quality of these adornments seem better than the other two cars here. Like the Mahindra, the rear with a similar full-width light arrangement compensates for slightly awkward proportions. Now yes, compared to the XUV 400 that's here, you do maybe miss out on soft materials. Most of this is hard plastic except for some bits here and here, whereas the Mahindra will give you soft surfaces all over the dash, even on the door cards here. So in that sense, it feels like a bit of a step down. But where the Kia really surpasses the Mahindra is, again, in terms of how these switches feel, in terms of generally the weight of the controls, these toggle switches here, the leather stitching, it all feels maybe a slight bit better than the Mahindra. Now the Mahindra, there has been a step up, especially with that new design in the waterfall effect and the lot of gloss black that both these cars use. So that has helped improve it. And there too you get a big bank of buttons in the middle, which are very easy to use, very similar to this. But yeah, in terms of the heft and the tactility of controls, it's really not quite at par with what the Kia has to offer. Now where does the Kiger fit into all of this? Remember, it's 5 lakhs cheaper than the other two cars, and that really does show on the inside. Now while the design itself is pretty modern, it has a very similar sort of layered sort of horizontal effect, quite like the Sonet here. It really does show in the kind of materials. The plastics feel a bit hollow, these controls feel really quite light, And yeah, that sense of heft really that you get in the other two cars is somewhat lacking in that. But the Kiger also goes to show that large screens and tech may not count for that much in the day-to-day. You have the smallest touchscreen of the lot here at 8 inches, but it is the only one with wireless phone pairing currently. It also happens to be a system that works smoothly and you don't miss all the snazzy displays and functions of the other two for the most part. The Sonet and XUV 3XO both give you 10.25-inch screens with navigation and crisp modern displays. But the Kia system is just that much easier to get used to. It's got a more logical layout, submenus are easier to access, and it is marginally smoother and more responsive. But it still happens to only come with a wired Android Auto and Apple CarPlay connection. These cars pair this with some equally smart 10.25-inch digital drivers displays. Both the Mahindra and Kia give you a good deal of information and are easier to toggle through. The XUV 3XO has more layout options and the Sonet has more fluid functioning, but both do the job quite well. The Kiger has a smaller 7-inch unit that is functional but not much more. Although again, that being said, you still do get some reasonably good stitching and upholstery in all the three cars here, but again it's the Sonet and the Mahindra that do really well with the perforations and just the textures even on the seats. The XUV 3XO could have done with more space in the central tunnel, but makes up for it with especially large door bins. They are smaller in the Sonet and Kiger, but the Kiger does give you large spaces in the center console as well as its step phone tray and central storage. You do miss out on cup holders, but you get an extra glove box. The Sonet makes up for it with the most charging ports all around. The Kiger has none in the back except for 12-volt charging and just one in the front, and the XUV does have a Type A and Type C port in the front like the Sonet, with just one Type C charger at the back. All three give you wireless charging. Now if space is your biggest priority and you carry 5 people quite often in your SUV, then the XUV 3XO is really the one to get for you, because as you can see it's a really wide car, so 3 abreast is much easier than in the other two, and just generally the sense of space here is really quite a step up from the other two cars here. Now that is helped by these large windows, this low sill and the generally white upholstery, as difficult as it will be to keep clean. And then of course you have this panoramic sunroof, it's a segment first feature. Now what you do miss is sunshades, which the Sonet gives you, which in a hot day like this would have been a great addition. Compared to this, the Sonet and the Kiger, they are clearly of a smaller size, and that really does show, especially when you want to fit 3 adults together. You find that one of them has to make a compromise, or one of them will find that your shoulders are brushing, so that's not very good. And between those two also there is some difference. We think the Kiger is generally the more comfortable of the two, mainly because of how the seat is contoured. It gives you more under thigh support. Now in terms of knee, head and leg room, again it's the XUV 400 that is really the one that's right at the top, unsurprisingly. As you can see, I have a lot of knee room, and even with the sunroof, you notice with the way the roof is scooped out, I have a good deal of headroom too. Now of course the Kiger and Sonet do well on that count, but you do notice that, especially if you're tall, you will notice that this kind of space is a bit lacking in those two. But in the Kiger, a small sort of nitpick is that when you try to tuck your feet under the seat, you can do it, you notice that the railings sort of get in the way. So another thing that sort of gets in the way of them is the dark cabin. They sort of gives you that compressed feeling, which in the Kiger is sort of exacerbated by the small windows. The Sonet and XUV 3XO do well to make you feel special, with both offering their share of high-impact features. The Kiger feels a touch outgunned, but it's still quite well equipped for the price. The Mahindra happens to have a clear edge in safety, and the Kiger lags by a good margin. Now a large part of the time that you spend with these cars will be in city traffic, and in that regard the XUV 3XO really is quite good. To start with, you have this expansive windscreen, so even though the car is wide, you have a good view out. These pillars aren't too large and you can see the bonnet, the edges of it very clearly. Now that's also the case with the Kiger, but you are somewhat hampered by a big blind spot here, so judging it in traffic isn't quite as simple, even though it's a more compact car. Now the Sonet 2 is compact and it doesn't have that problem, but what you do have is just generally placing it in traffic, because of how the view out isn't quite as simple as the other two. All the three cars here are powered by 3-cylinder turbo-petrols but are reasonably different in execution. The Mahindra is the quickest here by some margin with its 130 PS and 230 Nm. The overboost function that pushes this to 250 Nm is also quite a novelty. The Kiger makes a more modest 100 PS and 152 Nm, while the Sonet fills the gap at 120 PS and 172 Nm. A big differentiator in the driving experience is that all the three get varying gearbox types. The Mahindra uses a 6-speed torque converter, the Kia a 7-speed DCT and the Renault a CVT. Now one of the first things you notice is that the Mahindra is especially quiet and refined. There's barely any of those juddery vibrations that you expect in a 3-cylinder. So in most conditions you don't really notice that. Now the Sonet is some way behind that. You do notice it, especially when you're at idle, and even when you're driving you do feel it a bit more through the steering wheel, through the pedals. And in the Kiger it's especially apparent. It really does become noticeable. It really feels like it's, in terms of NVH, a rung below the other two, but that is to be expected considering its pricing. The Sonet with its extra ratio, its eco drive mode and tractable engine is the most efficient of the three cars here, especially on the highway where we managed nearly 18 km per litre. Surprisingly, the XUV 3XO is more efficient in traffic, very similar to the Kiger where it doesn't let the turbos spool up too often at low revs. Notably, the XUV 3XO needs 95 octane to function optimally, so you will be spending a tad bit more on fuel. Now, in the way that these engines perform, you notice that the Sonet is the most straightforward, and for many of you who are probably driving a turbo-petrol for the first time with these cars, this will probably make for most familiar driving because it's got a flat, very linear torque curve which makes getting used to it really quite simple. There are no surprises as such. And the power is available through the rev band, which also makes the engine quite tractable. So in a variety of situations you have power available to you most of the time. Now, quite opposite to this is how the XUV 3XO is. It starts off quite smoothly, especially off the line. It's probably the smoothest of all the engines here. But as soon as you hit that boost at about 2000 RPM, you notice that there is quite a significant surge. And if you haven't driven cars like these all that often, you might be caught surprised a few times as well. So in that situation, it does make for exciting driving, but you notice that once you're past that initial surge, it then sort of settles into a more mellow, smoother sort of experience, quite like the Sonet. Now the Kiger is a bit more old-fashioned, if you will. So you do have to work it a little bit in traffic when you notice that there is a noticeable amount of lag. It starts to make power a bit higher up in the rev band than the other two. So you have to work it a bit more. But once you do, there is enough for you to just keep going. And as you would expect, all these cars are plenty fast. The XUV is especially fast with that 10.7 second tested time. But the others at about 12-13 seconds, they also are by no means slow. The gearbox influences the driving experience further. The Sonet with its added ratio feels the most tractable in regular driving, but it's not so smooth at low speed driving, with jerkier shifts than the smooth, soft ones in the Mahindra's torque converter. Yes, the Mahindra's gearbox at medium speeds can hold on to higher gears for a touch longer than necessary, but past this, the gearbox is not too far behind the Sonet, fading into the background with intuitiveness. The CVT in the Renault is one of the better examples of its kind around. Yes, there is some of the delay you find in these gearboxes at lower speeds, but it does seem to get better the faster you go. But yes, you will have to be smoother in your inputs more often than in the other cars. Now, one of the things that you sometimes notice with these sub-4 meter SUVs is maybe they don't all of the times feel as sure-footed or as stable as, say, some bigger SUVs or sedans. Now, in that regard, the Sonet is sort of a culprit. So you will notice that at low speeds in regular city traffic, just over broken roads, it can feel a bit rough sometimes. And yes, it does get better as you go a bit faster, but even then you notice that at highway speeds, maybe there isn't that stability. You do notice that maybe it's not as well tied down as something bigger, wider, which is exactly where the XUV 400 comes in, because considering it's been based on something larger and that wide width and that long wheelbase, it's actually really quite stable. In fact, that's one of the more surprising attributes of it, considering Mahindra has sort of reworked the suspension tuning and it has that sort of frequency selective damping kind of system from the XUV 700. Now the rough surfaces, yes, you do feel them, but they're rounded off, so they don't really become uncomfortable. The Kiger also feels quite rugged and its low-speed ride is good too. There's just a slightly firmer edge to it than the Mahindra, but it isn't as sure-footed at high speeds. The Kiger's lightweight and agile steering makes it a relatively agile car around bends. It rolls less than the others and feels light and progressive around corners.
Now in that regard, the XUV also does well. You do notice that as long as you keep speeds within, say, what is normal driving, you do notice that all the body movements are progressive, they are again refined, so nothing surprises you. Now where does the Sonet fit in all of this? Again, it's a bit neutral. So yeah, if you are an especially enthusiastic driver, it may not sort of tick all your boxes, but again, if you just want a nice, comfortable, easy car for your everyday driving, it's really right up there. The steering, I must say, it has that very refined sense to it. It has that sort of smoothness to it, which the XUV has somewhat similar characteristics, but it's not as refined. So in that sense, it does help you, again, sort of get used to the Sonet really quite easily.
The Renault Kiger is still great value. It offers you good driving dynamics and reasonable comfort and performance, but is let down by refinement that other cars at this price do better. The Sonet is a strong choice for a large section of buyers with its premium feel, sharp looks, long features list and efficiency. But the Mahindra XUV 3XO gets close on most of these fronts while adding an especially spacious cabin, better comfort and driving dynamics.